2 days after buying this abandoned ranch, government vehicles surrounded Garrett Holloway's property and declared it a restricted zone. He stood on his new front porch, watching 3 black SUVs roll down his dirt driveway. The vehicles moved slowly, deliberately, like they belonged here more than he did. The lead vehicle stopped exactly 40 feet from his house, as if the driver knew the precise distance required for something Garrett couldn't name. Men in dark suits emerged, not looking at the house but at devices in their hands that beeped steadily. One agent held up a yellow tape that read words Garrett couldn't quite make out from this distance. The tape fluttered in the morning breeze, marking boundaries that hadn't existed when he went to sleep. The papers in Garrett's back pocket suddenly felt heavier than they should. His deed, signed and notarized 48 hours ago, had seemed straightforward when attorney Marcus Chen handed it over. Now, watching Agent Rodriguez approach with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse, Garrett wondered what those legal documents had failed to mention. The ranch had belonged to the Whitmore family for 60 years before they abandoned it 3 months ago. Old Henrik Whitmore had died, his children scattered to distant cities, leaving behind 800 acres of prime grazing land that nobody wanted to buy. Nobody except Garrett, who saw opportunity where others saw burden. Agent Rodriguez climbed the porch steps with the measured pace of a man delivering bad news. Her credentials gleamed in the morning sun as she introduced herself as a federal land management specialist. The words rolled off her tongue too smoothly. She had clearly practiced this conversation before. She explained that new geological surveys had revealed concerns about soil stability and potential environmental hazards that required immediate government intervention. The technical language meant nothing to Garrett, but the yellow tape being stretched around his property line meant everything. "Sir, effective immediately, this property has been designated a restricted access zone under federal jurisdiction," Rodriguez announced, handing him the manila folder. "You'll need to evacuate within 72 hours pending further environmental assessment." Garrett accepted the papers but didn't open them. Something about Rodriguez's story felt rehearsed, like actors hitting their marks in a play he hadn't auditioned for. Environmental hazards didn't appear overnight, and geological surveys took months to complete, not days. His military training had taught him to notice when intelligence briefings contained gaps, and this briefing had more holes than a target range. The beeping from the agent's devices grew faster as they approached the old barn behind his house. Whatever those machines were measuring, they were finding more of it near the structure Henrik Whitmore had used to store grain for 6 decades. Garrett watched the agents exchange glances and make notes in black notebooks, their movements too coordinated for a routine environmental check. 2 days ago, he had owned a ranch. Now, apparently, he owned a problem that required federal intervention. Garrett waited until the black SUVs disappeared down the county road before opening the manila folder. The documents inside made his stomach drop like he was falling from a helicopter without a parachute. Federal Environmental Emergency Assessment, signed by officials he had never heard of, dated yesterday. The signatures looked fresh, as if someone had been waiting for him to complete his purchase before drafting the paperwork. The technical language was designed to confuse, but Garrett's engineering background helped him decode the bureaucratic maze. According to the report, ground-penetrating radar had detected unusual mineral formations beneath his property that posed potential risks to groundwater contamination. The assessment cited rare earth elements and possible radioactive materials, requiring immediate federal oversight. What bothered Garrett wasn't the scientific terminology, but the timeline. These surveys allegedly took place last week, 3 days before he signed his deed. Henrik Whitmore's son lived in Denver, working as an insurance adjuster. Garrett found Thomas Whitmore's phone number in his purchase documents and dialed from his kitchen, staring out at the yellow tape that now surrounded his barn. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had been expecting this call. "They came to see me too," Thomas said before Garrett could explain why he was calling. "Yesterday afternoon, same woman, same folder, same story about environmental concerns. They offered to buy the ranch from us 6 months ago, but Dad refused to sell. Funny how these environmental issues only appeared after he died." Garrett gripped the phone tighter. "Who offered to buy it?" "Mountain Vista Development Corporation. They said they wanted to build some kind of research facility. Dad thought they were lying, said they acted more like mining scouts than developers. He spent his last months researching the company, trying to figure out what they really wanted with our land. The pieces started forming a picture Garrett didn't like. Mountain Vista Development sounded like the kind of corporate name designed to hide real intentions behind environmental buzzwords. Research facilities didn't need 800 acres of grazing land, but mining operations did. Thomas mentioned that his father had collected documents about unusual geological activity in the area, including reports of rare mineral deposits that mining companies had been quietly investigating for months. "Where are those documents now?" Garrett asked. "Dad hid them somewhere on the property. Said he didn't trust banks or lawyers after what happened to the Henderson family down the road. Their ranch was seized for back taxes that mysteriously appeared after they refused to sell to the same development company." After hanging up, Garrett walked to his barn despite the federal tape warning him to stay away. The structure looked ordinary enough from the outside, built from local timber and corrugated metal that had weathered decades of Colorado winters. Inside, hay bales lined the walls where Henrik had stored feed for cattle that no longer existed. The concrete floor showed wear patterns from years of heavy machinery, but nothing indicated why federal agents would find it interesting enough to measure with electronic devices. Garrett knelt near the back corner where the concrete met the wooden wall. His fingers traced along the edge until he felt something unusual, a slight depression in the floor that didn't match the surrounding surface. Someone had cut a section of concrete and replaced it carefully but not perfectly. The repair work was good enough to fool a casual inspection, but not someone looking for hidden storage spaces. Federal agents would return tomorrow with more equipment and more questions. Whatever Henrik Whitmore had discovered about this land, whatever Mountain Vista Development Corporation really wanted, Garrett needed to find those hidden documents before the government finished transforming his ranch into a restricted zone that would never be returned to civilian ownership. Garrett returned to the barn at dawn, carrying a crowbar and flashlight from his truck. The federal tape remained undisturbed, but tire tracks in the soft dirt showed that vehicles had circled his property during the night. Someone was watching, which meant he had limited time to uncover whatever Henrik Whitmore had hidden beneath the concrete floor. The crowbar bit into the repaired section easily, confirming that the concrete was newer than the surrounding foundation. Henrik had done quality work, but he wasn't a professional contractor. Within 20 minutes, Garrett had pried up a section large enough to reveal a metal box wrapped in plastic sheeting. The container felt heavy, packed with documents that Henrik had considered important enough to bury in his own barn floor. Inside the plastic, Garrett found geological surveys that painted a completely different picture than the federal paperwork Agent Rodriguez had delivered. These reports, commissioned by Henrik 6 months before his death, showed extensive lithium deposits throughout the property. Not dangerous radioactive materials or environmental hazards, but valuable rare earth minerals worth millions of dollars per acre. The surveys were signed by legitimate geological firms, not the shadowy federal departments mentioned in yesterday's assessment. Henrik had documented everything methodically, like a man preparing for legal battle. Mountain Vista Development Corporation wasn't a construction company at all, but a subsidiary of Meridian Resource Extraction, one of the largest mining conglomerates in North America. The Development Corporation was their acquisition arm, designed to purchase land quietly before announcing mining operations that would destroy local communities and environments. The most damaging document was a series of email printouts between Mountain Vista executives and someone identified only as Contact 7 in the Federal Land Management Office. The emails detailed a plan to fabricate environmental emergencies that would force landowners to sell to the government at below-market prices. Then those properties would be transferred to Meridian Resource through backdoor federal contracts. The Henderson family hadn't lost their ranch to tax problems. They had been targeted by the same systematic fraud now being used against Garrett. Henrik's research showed that Contact 7 had been facilitating these illegal land transfers for 3 years, earning substantial payments from Meridian Resource for each successful acquisition. The scheme worked because most rural landowners lacked the resources to fight federal environmental seizures, especially when faced with official documents and government authority. Garrett photographed every page with his phone, uploading the images to a cloud storage account that Henrik could never have imagined. The old rancher had relied on physical documents and hiding places, but digital evidence could be transmitted instantly to news organizations and law enforcement agencies beyond the reach of local corruption. A diesel engine rumbled in the distance, growing louder as it approached his driveway. Garrett quickly resealed the metal box and replaced the concrete section, scattering hay over the repair work to conceal his excavation. Through the barn door, he watched a convoy of government vehicles approaching with purpose that suggested this visit would be different from yesterday's polite environmental assessment. This time, The vehicles included a construction trailer and earth-moving equipment that told him the federal seizure was moving beyond paperwork into physical occupation. Agent Rodriguez emerged from the lead vehicle with a larger team and equipment designed for more than soil testing. Whatever timeline Mountain Vista had established for his property, it was accelerating faster than a legal challenge could stop it. Garrett slipped out the barn's rear door as the convoy reached his house, carrying Henrik's evidence and a growing understanding that his fight wasn't just about ranch ownership, but about exposing a conspiracy that had been stealing land throughout Colorado for years. Garrett made it to his truck before the federal team reached his front door, but Agent Rodriguez was already directing her men to secure the perimeter. She spoke into a radio headset, coordinating movements like a military operation rather than an environmental assessment. The construction trailer was being positioned near his barn, exactly where Henrik had hidden his evidence. Driving toward town, Garrett called the only lawyer he knew in Colorado. Marcus Chen had handled his ranch purchase, and while Chen specialized in real estate, he might know attorneys who dealt with federal seizures. The phone rang 4 times before Chen answered, his voice tight with an anxiety that hadn't been there 2 days ago. "Garrett, I was hoping you would call. We need to meet immediately, but not at my office. There are things about your ranch purchase that I couldn't discuss during the closing, things that put both of us at risk." They arranged to meet at Murphy's Diner on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a truck stop that stayed busy enough to provide cover for sensitive conversations. Chen was already seated in a back booth when Garrett arrived, nursing coffee that had grown cold while he waited. The lawyer looked like he hadn't slept since their last meeting. "Mountain Vista Development approached me 3 weeks before you made your offer," Chen began without preamble. "They wanted me to sabotage any competing bids for the Whitmore Ranch, to make sure no legitimate buyers could complete their purchases. When I refused, they made it clear that my cooperation wasn't optional." Chen explained that Mountain Vista had files on every major landowner in the county, detailing personal information that no development company should possess. They knew about Chen's tax problems, his daughter's college loans, his wife's medical bills. The implied threats were subtle but unmistakable. Cooperate with their land acquisition schemes or face financial ruin through legal harassment and regulatory challenges. "Why didn't you warn me during the closing?" Garrett asked. "Because they promised that military veterans would be exempt from their targeting. They said your service record made you too visible, too likely to attract media attention if something happened to your property. I thought you would be safe." Garrett showed Chen the photographs of Henrik's hidden documents on his phone. The lawyer's face went pale as he scrolled through images of the email exchanges with Contact 7. The conspiracy was larger and more systematic than Chen had realized, involving multiple federal agencies and dozens of fraudulent land seizures across 3 states. "This evidence could bring down the entire operation," Chen said, "but it also makes you extremely dangerous to them. If Mountain Vista realizes you have these documents, they'll accelerate their timeline to eliminate any threats to their business model." Chen's phone buzzed with a text message that made him curse under his breath. The message was from Agent Rodriguez, asking Chen to attend an emergency meeting about his client's property seizure. The federal team wasn't just moving fast, they were coordinating with local professionals to ensure complete control over the legal process. "They're trying to isolate you from legal representation," Chen warned. "If I attend that meeting, they'll find ways to disqualify me from representing you. If I refuse to attend, they'll claim I'm obstructing a federal investigation." Garrett understood the trap. Military operations often used similar tactics to neutralize enemy support systems before launching main attacks. Mountain Vista was treating his ranch ownership like a hostile occupation that required elimination through coordinated pressure from multiple angles. Chen handed him a business card for Angela Reeves, a federal public defender in Denver who specialized in cases involving government overreach. Reeves had successfully challenged fraudulent seizures before, but she would need time to build a legal strategy against an operation that had been months in planning. Time that Garrett probably didn't have, considering the construction equipment now occupying his property and the systematic approach being used to eliminate his support network. Whatever Mountain Vista had planned for his ranch, they intended to complete it before any legal challenges could stop their operation. The drive to Denver gave Garrett 2 hours to study Henrik's documents and plan his legal strategy. Angela Reeves operated from a cramped office near the federal courthouse, handling cases that other lawyers considered career suicide. When Garrett arrived, she was reviewing files spread across every surface in her office, preparing for 3 different federal seizure hearings scheduled that week. Reeves examined Henrik's evidence with the intensity of someone who had seen similar patterns before. The emails between Mountain Vista and Contact 7 contained details that matched cases she had been fighting for months. Federal environmental seizures had increased by 400% in Colorado during the past 2 years, always targeting properties with valuable mineral deposits that somehow became available for private development shortly after government acquisition. Your ranch is the 15th property seized using this exact environmental emergency protocol, Reeves explained, pointing to a map covered with red pins marking previous seizures. The pattern is always identical. Geological surveys appear suddenly after property transfers. Environmental hazards are discovered within days. Federal seizure follows immediately. Then the land gets transferred to development corporations through no-bid contracts. Garrett counted the red pins and felt his stomach sink. Mountain Vista wasn't running a small-scale operation. They were systematically acquiring mineral-rich properties across 3 counties using fraudulent federal authority. Each seizure generated millions of dollars in mining rights, while landowners received compensation far below market value for their confiscated property. Reeves showed him documents from previous cases where property owners had attempted to fight the seizures through traditional legal channels. Every case had been dismissed due to national security claims that prevented disclosure of evidence or sealed proceedings that excluded public oversight. Mountain Vista had perfected a system that made legal challenges nearly impossible to pursue successfully. The problem is proving federal fraud without access to classified documents, Reeves said. Henrik's evidence is exactly what we need to break their system, but they'll claim those emails were fabricated or obtained illegally. We need independent verification from someone currently inside the federal agencies involved. Garrett's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message contained a single line that made his blood run cold. Stop your investigation, or face the consequences that Henrik Whitmore discovered. The threat was unsigned, but the timing suggested someone was monitoring his communications and tracking his movements in real time. Reeves examined the message and immediately handed him a different phone from her desk drawer. The burner phone would provide temporary communication security, but it also confirmed that Garrett was now considered a direct threat to Mountain Vista's operation. The company was moving beyond legal maneuvering into intimidation tactics that suggested they planned to eliminate his resistance through any means necessary. They only send threats when they're running out of time, Reeves observed. Something is forcing them to accelerate their timeline, which means we have a narrow window to file injunctions before they complete their seizure process. Garrett thought about the construction equipment arriving at his ranch and the systematic pressure being applied to his support network. Mountain Vista wasn't just acquiring his property, they were preparing to begin mining operations immediately after securing federal approval. The environmental emergency was cover for an operation that had been planned months in advance. Reeves began drafting emergency motions to halt the seizure, while Garrett uploaded Henrik's evidence to secure servers that couldn't be accessed by federal agencies working with Mountain Vista. Whatever happened to his ranch, the evidence of systematic fraud would survive to expose the conspiracy that had been stealing land across Colorado for years. The burner phone rang while Garrett and Reeves were preparing federal court documents. The caller identified himself as James Morrison, a geologist who had worked on several Mountain Vista surveys before discovering their fraudulent practices. Morrison's voice carried the tension of someone who had been hiding for weeks, afraid to contact authorities who might be compromised by the same corruption he was trying to expose. Morrison explained that he had resigned from his consulting firm after being ordered to falsify environmental assessments for Mountain Vista properties. The company required reports showing environmental hazards that didn't exist, using fabricated data to justify federal seizures of mineral-rich land. When Morrison refused to sign false documents, Mountain Vista threatened his professional licenses and personal safety. They have federal employees on their payroll in multiple agencies, Morrison revealed. Environmental protection, land management, geological survey, even some Treasury investigators who help them manipulate tax assessments. Contact 7 isn't just one person. It's a network of corrupt officials who facilitate these land transfers for substantial payments. Garrett asked Morrison to provide documentation of the fraudulent surveys, but the geologist explained that Mountain Vista had confiscated all his files and equipment after his resignation. However, Morrison had memorized the locations of 15 properties where he had been ordered to falsify environmental data, including detailed information about their actual mineral content and the real companies that would benefit from mining operations. Reeves recorded Morrison's testimony while drafting subpoenas for federal agencies that might contain legitimate employees willing to testify against the corruption. The legal strategy was risky because it assumed that honest federal workers existed within agencies that had been compromised by Mountain Vista's systematic bribery, but Morrison's testimony provided the independent verification they needed to challenge the seizure in court. Morrison also revealed that Mountain Vista was planning to complete their operation within 72 hours, before any legal challenges could halt their federal authorization. The construction equipment at Garrett's ranch wasn't just for show. They intended to begin mining operations immediately after completing the property transfer to avoid prolonged legal battles that might expose their fraudulent methods. Garrett's ranch wasn't the final target. It was the testing ground for expanded operations throughout the western United States. Mountain Vista had identified hundreds of properties with valuable mineral deposits and was preparing to replicate their Colorado success in Nevada, Montana, and Wyoming. The federal seizure protocol they had developed was designed to acquire billions of dollars in mining rights through systematic fraud on a massive scale. During their conversation, Morrison's voice became increasingly agitated as he described vehicles circling his current hiding location. The geologist was convinced that Mountain Vista was tracking him through electronic surveillance, possibly with assistance from federal agencies that had access to advanced monitoring capabilities. Morrison ended the call abruptly, promising to contact them again from a different location if he remained safe. Reeves immediately filed emergency injunctions with 3 different federal judges, hoping that at least one court would agree to halt the seizure pending investigation of Morrison's allegations. The legal documents contained Henrik's evidence and Morrison's testimony, creating a comprehensive challenge to Mountain Vista's authority that would force them to defend their environmental claims in public proceedings. Garrett checked the news on his phone and discovered that his ranch seizure had been mentioned in local media reports as a routine environmental protection measure. Mountain Vista was using their federal connections to control the narrative, preventing accurate reporting about the mineral deposits and fraudulent surveys that motivated their land acquisition. The company's media strategy was as sophisticated as their legal manipulation, ensuring that public opinion would support government seizures that appeared to protect environmental resources, while actually facilitating corporate theft of valuable minerals. The federal judge granted Reeves's emergency injunction at 6 a.m, halting all seizure activities at Garrett's ranch, pending a full investigation of Morrison's fraud allegations. Judge Patricia Williams had reviewed Henrik's evidence and Morrison's testimony throughout the night, recognizing patterns that matched similar cases from other districts where mining companies had been caught manipulating federal agencies for illegal land acquisition. Garrett drove back to his property expecting to find the construction equipment being removed, but instead discovered that Mountain Vista had ignored the federal court order completely. Heavy machinery was actively excavating near his barn, exactly where Henrik had hidden the evidence documents. Agent Rodriguez was directing operations with radio communications that suggested they planned to complete their mineral extraction before any additional legal proceedings could stop them. The court injunction meant nothing if federal agencies continued operating under Mountain Vista's direction, rather than legitimate government authority. Garrett realized that the corruption ran deeper than individual agents accepting bribes. The entire seizure operation was being conducted outside normal federal oversight, with the assumption that no court would challenge their environmental emergency claims. Garrett called Reeves from his truck, reporting the violation of the federal court order while photographing the ongoing excavation with his phone. The attorney immediately contacted Judge Williams's chambers and the FBI regional office, filing contempt of court charges against every federal agent participating in the unauthorized seizure activities. The legal system was finally responding to the systematic fraud, but Mountain Vista was gambling that they could extract enough lithium to justify any legal penalties they might face later. Morrison called the burner phone while Garrett was documenting the illegal mining operation. The geologist had discovered that Mountain Vista was planning to abandon their Colorado operations within 24 hours, moving their equipment and personnel to Nevada before federal investigations could expose the full extent of their fraudulent land seizures. They intended to complete the lithium extraction at Garrett's ranch, then disappear before facing consequences for their systematic corruption of federal agencies. They've been planning this exit strategy for months, Morrison explained. Every property seizure was designed to generate maximum mineral extraction in minimum time, then transfer operations to new states before local authorities could investigate their methods. Your ranch is their final Colorado target before they replicate this entire system in Nevada and Montana. Garrett watched excavators destroying his property, while federal agents prevented him from approaching his own land. The restricted zone designation was being used to exclude the actual property owner, while Mountain Vista harvested millions of dollars in rare earth minerals that legally belonged to him. The environmental emergency had become cover for the largest mineral theft in Colorado history. Reeves called with news that FBI agents from Denver were driving to Garrett's ranch with arrest warrants for Agent Rodriguez and 3 other federal employees identified in Henrik's email evidence. The investigation had expanded beyond Garrett's case to include 15 other fraudulent seizures, creating a federal prosecution that Mountain Vista could not influence through their corrupt contacts within government agencies. The sound of approaching helicopters made Rodriguez and her team stop their excavation activities. Federal law enforcement was finally arriving with authority that superseded Mountain Vista's corrupted environmental emergency protocol. Garrett realized that Henrik Whitmore's hidden evidence had accomplished what the old rancher had hoped for when he buried those documents beneath his barn floor. The systematic fraud that had stolen land across Colorado was about to be exposed in federal court, with evidence that would send corrupt agents to prison and return stolen properties to their rightful owners. FBI agents arrested Rodriguez and her team within minutes of landing at Garrett's ranch. The federal agents had been operating under falsified authority documents that Mountain Vista had created, using their corrupt contacts within multiple government agencies. When legitimate federal investigators examined the paperwork, they discovered that the environmental emergency designation had never been properly authorized. The excavation equipment fell silent for the first time in days. Garrett walked across his property line, no longer blocked by yellow tape or federal agents with fraudulent authority. The hole they had dug near his barn would need to be filled, but the land beneath his boots was his again. Rodriguez sat in the back of a federal transport vehicle, her confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of someone whose carefully constructed lies had finally collapsed. Morrison emerged from hiding to testify against the conspiracy, providing the technical evidence that federal prosecutors needed to dismantle the entire operation. The geologist's courage in speaking out had saved not just Garrett's ranch, but dozens of other properties across the region that Mountain Vista had targeted for similar seizures. Judge Williams voided the environmental emergency designation within the week. The federal government compensated Garrett for damages caused by the illegal seizure, and legitimate geological surveys confirmed what Henrik Whitmore had suspected all along. The lithium deposits beneath Garrett's ranch were worth millions of dollars, which he could now develop through legal mining contracts with companies that operated within proper environmental regulations. 6 weeks later, Garrett stood on his front porch watching the sunset paint his restored property in shades of gold and amber. The construction equipment was gone, replaced by grazing cattle he had purchased with his first mineral rights payment. The barn where Henrik had hidden his evidence now stored legitimate farming equipment instead of buried secrets. The yellow tape had been removed, the restricted zone designation erased from federal records. Mountain Vista executives faced federal prison sentences for conspiracy and fraud. Their systematic theft of private property had been exposed and dismantled, ensuring that other ranchers would never face the same fraudulent seizures that had nearly cost Garrett everything he owned. Henrik Whitmore's hidden evidence had accomplished exactly what the old rancher had hoped when he buried those documents beneath his barn floor. The government agents who had declared his ranch a restricted zone 2 days after purchase were now serving time for corruption. The mining company that had orchestrated the fraud was paying substantial fines to victims across 3 states. Garrett had his ranch back, his financial security established, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served to criminals who thought they were above the law. The wind carried the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures, a peaceful sound that Garrett had imagined when he first bought this abandoned property. His military service was behind him, the conspiracy against his land was defeated, and his future stretched ahead as wide and open as the Colorado horizon. If you enjoyed this story of one man's fight against corruption and fraud, click on the next video to discover another tale from the American West, where ordinary people face extraordinary challenges. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us bring you more authentic stories of courage and justice from the frontier.